Okay, so the theme is why fantasy matters, and as Lev noted before this, we're going to just sort of assume that most of the people here already think that it does. But I'm going to ask each of you, why wouldn't it matter? Have any of you ever felt the need to sort of defend yourself or your work because someone suggested that it didn't matter?
I would say I certainly have felt that pressure, but not for professional work, because as soon as someone starts paying you for it, it's almost always okay, you know, whatever. But for fanfic, you know, I think there's definitely, but more broadly, because I think most people here are interested in a more broad topic, I think more broadly there's definitely some undercurrent of people who mistrust fiction as a whole, and mistrust things that they don't sort of understand, and who prefer kind of a narrow, constrained view. And I feel like that's really the only situation in which I can imagine somebody really feeling that fantasy doesn't matter. And that would be very sad.
I guess, you know, I have had conversations, including with relatives, where I get the feeling that, where you know, where somebody actually is not going to be persuaded that there's something worthwhile in fantasy or in fiction. And that's always kind of a relief. It's a very short conversation. They're not looking to be persuaded. And it's actually harder if they are somebody who genuinely loves books and maybe a certain kind of fantasy, but not the kind that you write. Because in that case you are on the same page, but you feel kind of bad because you're not actually doing the kind of work that they would enjoy.
I guess the context in which I've encountered people who think that fantasy does not matter, more as a critic than as an author. When I started reviewing books for Time, I'm the book critic at Time, and it was unusual for fantasy to get reviewed in Time because people felt that it didn't matter. And I guess the charge that, and it's been sort of a project of mine to get more fantasy into Time, and we have, which is great. And I guess the charge that, you know, is most often leveled when I bring up these books and say, hey, we should be covering this, is that, well, it's escapism. It's, you know, a way for people to avoid reality, and here at Time magazine, reality is our speciality. But, you know, you can point out, you point out that, in fact, you know, the worlds, the fantastical worlds that are depicted in these books are not always necessarily, it's not as though they're not worlds in which, they're not fantasies in the sense of, like, in the psychological sense, like a fantasy where everything, you can have whatever you want. These are worlds where the problems are very real, and you're sort of encountering problems that are recognizable from the real world in a kind of transfigured form. George R.R. Martin, his world is not one that you would wish to escape into.
It's like fantasy gives you frequently can be used to give you a kind of distance from, you know, where you actually are, from the topic that you sort of want to slip in there for your readers. And if you're not doing that, then I think it doesn't capture. If you aren't telling a real story, despite it being fantasy, then I don't think it captures.
You're getting traction on real issues and real problems, and that's sort of so that's the exchange. Well, that's round one of the exchange. Yeah.
I had an exchange with a colleague at work last week. I need to pull the mic away. Is that audible?
Just pull it towards you.
Yeah, there you go.
Is that audible?
Yes.
Wow, that sounds right. Okay, yes. My version of the Does What You Do Matter exchange was with a colleague at work last week who...
You're a lawyer, right?
I'm a lawyer, who we had 5 minutes of empty time before a meeting. He looked at me and asked, that thing you do. I took to mean writing as opposed to some sort of weird personality. That thing you do. Does anybody make a living doing that. I said, well, not me personally, but some people. Sort of nodded and laughed. So that was sufficient to establish the matter.
I hope you built him for those hours.
Well, actually, he was my superior, so I said, that's a good point. Thank you for your insights. I enjoyed that conversation.
But that could just be writing fiction
But that's,
in general.
that's writing fiction in general. Yes. I mean, I think I haven't had the is fantasy specific worthwhile conversation with anybody except people who actually write fantasy and feel the need to be self-critical of what they're doing. I mean, I think for people who are outside of that world, I've only encountered people who are either completely indifferent to fiction, period, or regard it as a form of fiction. Maybe they're just being nice.
I guess there are people who sort of criticize genre in general, genre fiction as a category. But to be fair, I don't like mainstream fiction as a category in general. So,
how would you, define it? Because your books are all very different. So I had to sit and think, well, what have they all got in common? Almost nothing. So, how do you define it in your head? What's inside and what's outside your definition of fantasy? Or do you worry about that?
not really. I feel like, you write what comes out, you write the story that you've got to write at the time, and that's fun to tell, and it's all about marketing in a certain sense, but you figure that out after you've got it written anyway.
Yeah, my definition of fantasy is pretty inclusive. I read a mystery series recently by a writer named Colin Conroll, and got 3 chapters in the first one. I thought, well, nobody told me this was fantasy, and I was already enjoying it, but I felt this kind of delight, and also I thought, well, this is fantasy, and so I often read books and think, well, this is fantasy. So
I wish that happened to me more often, actually.
Absolutely.
I wish that happened on television. Wouldn't it be awesome if, like, one day in the middle of CSI, suddenly there was, like, a wizard? That'd be so exciting.
Finally, something new would happen on CSI. I mean, are there any sort of ways, or do you worry? Often science fiction and fantasy are conflated. Sometimes it's because the same people like to read the 2 genres. But do you feel like there's a clear line between them?
I mean, it's hard to come up with rigorous definitions, because I feel like one of the functions of novels in general is to chew up rigorous definitions and reveal them for just brittle facades or whatever. Well, I think if there's magic going on, it's fantasy. That's my rule. That's my rule of thumb. And then I try not to think about it anymore.
The supernatural?
Magic.
Yeah.
Not thinking about it anymore.
Okay. What about you?
I don't know. I mean, what does Doctor Who count as?
Speak closer to the microphone.
I asked what Doctor Who counts as, having just watched it last night. There's the. Insofar as there's a distinction between science fiction and fantasy, there's hard science fiction which tries to have scientific rigor, but there's very, very little of that, and most of it isn't actually that rigorous as one understands it, insofar as one understands science. If there's a distinction between fantasy and the kind of science fiction that plays fast and loose with science, it really is, I think, just the sort of tropes it's pointing at, the sort of whether it's, it sounds silly to say whether it's got dragons or spaceships or wizards in it, but I don't know if there is more to it than that.
There's a definition that I liked a great deal. I think there's Teresa Nielsen Hayden, who's an editor at Tor, who said she was asked if there was anything that define something as fantasy as opposed to science fiction, because a lot of work does blur the two. And she said if it has the Holy Grail in it, then it's fantasy. I say I really like that.
So what can you do with those tools, with the Holy Grail or the dragons or whatever, in your particular, the magicians, the specialist hat, or whatever it is whatever the fantasy elements that you're using in your work. You talked about it a little bit. It's like a way of dealing with a theme that maybe people might come to with a lot of baggage and kind of sneaking, or I know you said that as well, kind of sneaking it in a different form. Is that a big attraction?
I guess for me, what I really enjoy about the Temeraire books that I write is that the dragons are kind of the tool that I use to explore the what if, the alternate universe. And I do like particularly the kind of fantasy where you sort of try and get the reader to buy in one thing, and then the rest you sort of try and treat with realism. For myself, obviously, I always sort of love reading. I think more, Le Guin's work, for example, actually is I think, and some Patricia McKillip's work, where it's more, I don't know how to describe it exactly, but I know it when I see it. That a sort of more, help me out.
I was thinking about this. I took the train down, so I was thinking about this, and I think one of the things about working with fantasy or surreal or even satirical or super real material is that you are creating a narrative in which there's never just a single reading. There's always sort of another level, which is moving around below the surface, and so there you have these two levels, which are there also in realistic fiction, but that are not quite as, I think, fluid. And it's much more possible to get a number of different readings into a work in which there are things which maybe stand-ins for whatever the reader or the author wants to put in there. And that, when I read, I really like work in which I am having to think about the material in more than one way, and even more than two. I don't like work where I understand everything that's going on. I think, yes, this is right. This is all maps onto my experience. I actually want something that makes me think about things in a different way.
I have many thoughts that I'm just really struggling to put into words. But what Kelly said about working on several levels at once rings very true to me. I mean, one of the sort of just magnificent things about writing fantasy is, this is one of the things I can't explain, but I'm going to try to. When you write realist fiction, which I have done, there is one thing going on in a certain sense. You are describing reality, and everybody's recognizing it in reality and saying, "Oh, he nailed it. That is real. That is just how things happen." When you're writing fantasy, this wonderful thing happens, which is everybody knows about reality. They all know what would really happen, and then you're playing with reality. You're breaking its rules. And so there's this wonderful sense in which you're kind of harmonizing with the reality. Everybody knows the reality, and then you're doing a kind of melody line above reality, and people can sort of feel the harmonies between them. So there's all this strange doubleness of the fictional and the real. You're not trying to overlay onto the real. You're not tracing the real. You're just sort of performing arabesques above it. It's very fun. Not nearly as athletic as that sounds.
That rings true to me as well. I mean, in a sense, that's true of a lot of stuff which isn't fantasy as such, but is non-realistic, which is much broader than fantasy, or simply not set in the actual world, but the introduction of the fantastic element, the non-realistic element, the making of the world as an additional layer of interest and something that creates friction with the story itself. I think is one of the appealing things about it.
Well, and I think that all four of you have found really fertile ground with sort of cross-pollinating with other genres. Like Naomi, I think of you as working with historical fiction, the Western with your book, you with the sort of coming-of-age novel, and you, I don't know about you. Can't put you in any of those boxes. Experimental fiction. I think of you as being, partly a fantasy writer and partly an experimental fiction writer. I don't know, maybe that doesn't ring true for you, but can you talk a little bit about what it's like to sort of, first, why you wanted to do that? Did you intentionally say, Naomi, did you intentionally say, I guess I'm thinking that probably you read Patrick O'Brien.
Yes. And I absolutely did.
And that you
and I read Pern. And that's at a distance of some years from one another. But no, I do think that cross-pollination happens in all of us all the time. I don't really believe in sort of a myth of originality as a kind of, seed springing new out of untouched soil. So I think that for me, one of the reasons that I enjoy working in a historical era is that it has some of the same pleasures for me as writing fantasy in general. That the two share a lot of satisfying traits. The world building, that you're creating a world that there is this sort of same tension between past and present as opposed to fictional and real, and also just the pleasure of the narrative voice that is sort of historical, that's not a modern voice, is a lot of fun to work in as a writer on a sort of just a sentence level, and that's one of the attractions for me. But also working in history with a fantastical element gives you a chance to take things that people know even the outcome of. Everybody knows how the Napoleonic Wars ended, but they don't know how they end in my books. And yet, people, so there's also that tension between what people know happened and what might happen. And that's a lot of fun.
I grew up reading work which is not necessarily the kind of story that I write. So I read and loved a lot of very pure, fantasy novels, sort of classic fantasy novels, and I can't seem to do that. But I also read a lot of short story writers, people like Saki and John Collier and John Eakin, and it did seem to me that I could continue to do that sort of thing. And then, I think there's always an element, or at least for me, of the mashup, which is, I think, the same kind of thing you're talking about, where you think, well, what if I take the elements from these forms and, also add some other things. But that mostly what I want when I write is actually what I want a lot of the time is just I want to write a ghost story. It's just I don't seem to be able to approach that head on way.
Do you think of yourself as a horror writer? What?
I think of myself as a science fiction writer. And that's not accurate. I still think of myself as a science fiction writer.
Well, there is that sort of saying that all short stories are ghost stories. So, and maybe that explains one of the reasons why that's the form that you work in the most.
Wait, what does that mean?
I've heard that expression before. No, it doesn't sound accurate.
I think it's a metaphorical.
It has to do with mood and with the feeling of voice, mood, communication, and also sort of that flash.
The evocation of things that can't really be explained.
I got it.
I'm looking at you.
I know. I forget what the question is, though.
The question is about
mashing up,
mashing
All
up,
right.
crashing, you know, like, did you start out thinking, okay, I'm gonna take, you know, less than 0 and turn it into, you know, I'm gonna.
Oh yeah, no, I did. I mean, I definitely didn't think that, but I did think a lot about. One thinks all kinds of really grandiose, unacceptable things when one is starting out a novel in order to try to get oneself to actually do it. I have an academic background, sort of. I spent a few years in graduate school, and I was really interested in the modernists.
That was the end of everything.
And yet, the beginning. I was really interested in the modernists, and Joyce and Virginia Woolf in particular. And I was always interested in the fact that they were writing and doing their things with the novel at the same time as the sort of, for lack of a better expression, modern fantasy tradition was getting off the ground. They were writing at the same time as C.S. Lewis and Tolkien and Hope Mirrlees and Robert E. Howard. And I always thought that it was so fascinating because their traditions were so separate from one another, and the kind of really rigorously realistic world building that the modernists did, and it was world building. They were very, very meticulous as observers of the real world around them. And I sort of thought, what would happen if you kind of collapsed these two traditions that had existed side by side but separate from one another? And I thought a lot about that. What would happen if Woolf wrote a fantasy novel? What would a fantasy novel by Joyce look like? You know, I thought a lot about that and sort of importing some of those modernist techniques into fantasy.
Well, I think the people who, at least C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, thought of what they were doing as a response to modernism and as a sort of a counterweight to it. So, in a way, it was almost partly conceived of that way, so that you were just setting yourself up to combine two things that were opposites, or were conceived of as opposites.
Right. Well, it's sort of, I don't know. That's just what I thought. I'm not going to try to, I will not school you on Lewis and Tolkien since you wrote the book. You know, I think there's a synthesis, you know, whatever, 80 years on, there's a kind of synthesis that can be done between the two traditions.
And so I'm curious, Felix, about your use of the Western, because I feel like a lot of the sort of fantasy elements of your book are like a comment on the Western.
That's somewhat true. It didn't. I certainly didn't set out in this book to write a Western or a mashup of fantasy and Western. And it's not as though the Western actually holds any huge resonance for me, though. I've read and went out and read a lot of Zane Grey and Louis Moore, etc. I think it started more as a particular sort of appealing historical moment, and I wanted to look at the sort of various myths of that and the stories of that, and the Western is one of them. So yeah, there's a lot of bits of the Western thrown in. But I think I saw it less as a mashup of sort of, and the fantasy element, it's got a big MacGuffin quest, and you know, it's got a lot of fairly sort of straightforwardly fantastic elements of that kind, that sort of fantasy storytelling, and all sorts of bits and pieces of other kinds of stories or myths that are getting thrown in and pulled apart. I hope we'll come to that. The sequel has a lot more of not Western so much as rags to riches stories.
So like Horatio Algernon type thing. I was just running through all the 19th century and American. I was surprised to discover that you were British, because I thought that you were sort of engaging with Americanness.
Well, I've lived here for a very long time.
Oh, okay.